Empathy deficit disorder, the missing piece in understanding school shooters and our wireless world. When we talk about autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, we often consider environmental contributors, from chemical pollutants to dietary factors and increasingly, electromagnetic fields, or EMFs. Yet there's another condition that may lurk beneath society's radar: empathy deficit disorder, EDD. While not as commonly discussed or officially classified like ASD or ADHD, the concept of EDD raises a critical question. If empathy can be disrupted by environmental factors, should we look at external stressors like microwave radiation and digital overload as potential contributors? This line of thought becomes even more urgent when we consider acts of extreme violence, such as school shootings. If a lack of empathy, an inability to fully appreciate the feelings and rights of others, is a hallmark of those who commit such atrocities, we must ask, could these perpetrators be suffering from a form of EDD exacerbated by modern environmental influences? What is empathy deficit disorder, EDD? Though not a formal clinical diagnosis in the DSM-5, the concept of EDD has been explored by mental health professionals to describe individuals who struggle to understand, resonate with, or respond to other people's emotions. EDD can manifest as apathy, cruelty, or even violence, as the moral compass that relies on feeling another's pain is dulled. Environmental factors and neurological development. For conditions like ASD and ADHD, we increasingly suspect that environmental contributors interact with genetic predispositions. Recent threads of research suggest that environmental noise from microwave radiation, EMFs, blue light exposure, and other modern pollutants might subtly alter brain chemistry, hormone balances, and cellular communication. EMFs and neural circuits. Studies show EMFs can alter neurotransmitters, induce oxidative stress, and disrupt voltage-gated calcium channels, influencing how brain cells communicate. While ASD and ADHD have gained attention for their possible links to these mechanisms, the capacity for empathy, housed in complex prefrontal and limbic circuits, may be just as vulnerable. Low-fidelity developmental environments. If EMF exposure can degrade attention or increase anxiety, why not also empathy? Just as ADHD is linked to EMF exposure in studies with mice, subtle changes in bioelectric signaling could impair the brain's empathy networks. If children grow up in a world saturated with wireless signals and digital stimuli that fragment attention spans, might these same conditions erode empathy? EDD in the context of school shooters. School shootings represent an extreme breakdown of moral and emotional regulation. While multiple factors, mental health issues, access to firearms, social isolation, converge, a persistent question lingers. How could a young person commit such unspeakable acts of harm? A school shooter likely shows signs of EDD. They fail to resonate with the suffering they inflict. They may demonstrate cold disregard for human life, a glaring empathy gap. If we accept that empathy, like attention or learning, is influenced by neurodevelopment and can be compromised by environmental stressors, it's plausible that these environmental inputs contribute to a state of EDD. This doesn't absolve personal responsibility or negate other factors, but it broadens our understanding. The perpetrator's brain might have developed under cumulative stressors, EMFs, digital saturation, and other pollutants, undermining the neural pathways that support empathy. Why aren't we talking about environmental causes of EDD? ASD and ADHD have been extensively studied, in part because they present clear cognitive and behavioral symptoms that affect academic performance, social integration, and daily functioning. Empathy deficits, on the other hand, are more elusive. They're moral and emotional shortcomings rather than easily quantifiable learning problems. Society may resist framing empathy loss as a potential environmental outcome, perhaps fearing it would diminish personal accountability or open a Pandora's box of complicated policy issues. But if we acknowledge that the environment can influence attention, social cue reading, and identity formation, isn't it consistent to consider empathy as well? Empathy is a function of healthy neural circuitry, just as attention and emotional regulation are. If EMFs and other stressors corrode these circuits, They could foster conditions where EDD thrives. The need for research. To connect the dots between EMF exposure and empathy deficits, rigorous studies are needed. These would look at neuroimaging, identifying whether EMF exposure correlates with changes in brain regions responsible for empathy, like the medial prefrontal cortex, anterior insula, and mirror neuron networks. Longitudinal studies tracking children's EMF exposure and empathy-related behaviors over time. Do those with higher EMF exposure show a measurable decline in empathy-related measures? Intervention trials, reducing screen time, nighttime blue light, or EMF exposure, and observing whether there's a corresponding improvement in empathy scores in susceptible individuals. Policy and precaution. If research confirms that EMFs and digital overload contribute to empathy erosion, policymakers must act. This might mean revising safety standards for EMFs to consider non-thermal effects on emotional and cognitive development, encouraging wired connections in schools, especially in early grades, to reduce exposure for developing minds. Public education campaigns raising awareness of the potential cognitive and emotional impacts of constant digital engagement and wireless radiation. Conclusion. Recognizing EDD as part of a bigger puzzle. Empathy deficit disorder may not yet be a clinically defined condition, but the concept resonates in an era where extreme violence and moral numbness appear too often. If we have compelling reasons to suspect environmental factors in ASD and ADHD, it's time to extend that inquiry to empathy deficits. School shooters may represent the darkest outcome of a society where empathy can falter under environmental assault. By exploring environmental influences on EDD, we may gain a crucial piece of the puzzle. Understanding and mitigating these factors could help restore the moral and emotional grounding our youth need, ensuring that empathy, rather than apathy or violence, becomes the standard setting for the human heart and mind. Visit RF Safe to learn more.